Good day, ladies and gentlemen. The topic of my talk today is how Egyptian family businesses can play a greater role in advancing and growing Egypt's economy. All right, we're ready? But before I do, it's important to note the following key figures that have been shared with a group of distinguished family business leaders during the Family Business Consortium established and led by the AUC. The figures are eye-opening, and we can start by saying that family businesses in the Arab region contribute 60% of GDP and employ over 80% of the workforce, according to the latest PwC Family Business Report. And the major challenge facing family businesses today is that 70% of them disappear and perish with the passing of the owner. This statement says something louder than the numbers. And to me, it says it is business. Name it family, name it whatever you want to name it, it is business. It fails and succeeds for the fundamental reasons that govern a business through its journey. Now, while there might be many theories and handbooks on how to transition family-run businesses to becoming institutions that drive growth sustainably, the practice itself is far more than challenging. Today, most Egyptian family businesses, with the exception of a few, of course, are classified in US dollar revenue terms as small and medium enterprises. And the key question is, how do we change this? How do we become institutions that are regionally and globally recognized, thus contributing far greater value to Egypt's GDP and tax revenues while generating new jobs to employ our youth, our real capital? The main focus today should be, or one of the main focuses should be, how can Egyptian industries create platforms that enable foreign direct investment to start pouring into our economy? If we look at the latest figures of Egyptian FDI for the first 9 months of 2017 and 2018, we will note the following. 66% has gone into petroleum, 10% has gone into manufacturing, 0% in agriculture, 4% in construction, 12% in services, including real estate and financial services. Needless to say that the absolute figure itself is humble, to say the least. So there is great room, there is potential here. I can comment on the agricultural export space myself, as I do find it very disappointing that I do represent the agriculture export space, and it's very difficult to comprehend the fact that we were unable to close any significant transactions, seeing the fundamentals on the ground, seeing the extensive distribution network that some of the traders have, moving product from the south of Egypt all the way to the governance and across liquid businesses, yet still none of them were able to close a transaction or even qualify for a due diligence. And why? Simply because the platform doesn't exist. The platform that will cater to the foreign investor doesn't exist. Now, so the point of the discussion here is how we can generate platforms, how we can build platforms to attract foreign direct investment into our small and medium enterprise space. Now, although emerging markets have seen a setback lately, growth capital is still actively seeking out investments in emerging markets. While the process is far more competitive today than it was, Egypt industries have the fundamentals that drive investors' appetites still. We have the power, and we always say it, the power of the 104 million, and we can write stories about that. Everything from consumption to human capital to labor to skilled labor, it's all there. The platform, however, is still not up to that standard. So, having said this, having the right business model and solid fundamentals is not the only prerequisite to actually locking in or closing a transaction and attracting growth capital. The business needs to endure an investor's due diligence and stress test. It's simple. I can remember many cases, without mentioning names of course, of investors walking away from great potentials simply because the platform was shaky, to say the least. The financial disciplines were loose, and the way the business was run made it a non-viable concern, although they have a very good business model and good potential. So in order to attract that growth capital, which by the way should not only bring with it financial support, it should also bring strategic support that could accelerate growth and generate greater value, the following needs to be considered. There is the role of the family, the business owner, call it what you want. And obviously, we can start by saying the obvious, corporate governance. This is the obvious. A lot of families in Egypt, a lot of business owners in Egypt have engaged and have hired consultants to talk about corporate governance and how it's implemented. But the focus from what we've seen, and this is practice, there's no data behind this, was always on how the family deals with each other and how the cousins talk to each other, which is quite frankly a non-concern at this point in time. The concern and the focus should be slightly changed. And while corporate governance is comprehensive, the focus should be on institutionalizing the business rather than the family and how cousins deal with each other. Focus on sustainable growth. Implement risk management measures that make your business resilient. Succession planning needs to start bottom up, not top down. Many people address succession planning by looking at the senior management and how and who's going to be the next MD, who's going to be the next chairman, but nobody considered the makers, the shakers and makers of the operation. The bottom, some of them, a lot of them are over a certain age bracket without mentioning any numbers, and there are no successors. And when they fail, the operation fails from the bottom, from the core. So succession planning needs to start bottom up rather than top down. Understand your rigid core. Whenever you are a business that is run as a family or an SME, you have a core that has led you to that point at this point in time. Having younger members of the business come in and try to change that core or muscle that core is not going to work. Understand your rigid core in terms of human capital. Understand how you can respect that rigid core and how they can be part of the journey, of the transitional journey. Keep that due diligence checklist in front of you at all times. Manage your financial disciplines. These are just some pieces of advice that investors have come in. They've looked at businesses and they've walked away. They've walked away again from sound models, from sound economic models, simply because they see financial disciplines that are so loose across the business and they simply become uninterested or actually shy away from the investment itself. So manage your financial disciplines and embrace the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy needs to be efficient, but also needs to be embraced. It's not something to be taken lightly. Delegate, of course. As business owners, it is always very difficult to let go of that authority, to let go of that power. So long as you're holding it there, you're going to stay there, you're going to be an SME. Your only way to move forward is to attract external, annoying board members to your team, have them come in, scrutinize you, tell you what you're doing wrong, and be okay with it, and delegate authority on that front. Once that platform is stable, you will get your fair valuation. FDI will flow as growth capital at a much faster pace, thus benefiting Egypt and growing your business beyond your own means financially and strategically. Secondly, second to the role of the business owners is the government role. Over the past 2 years, Egypt has lived through the most courageous economic reform program. The initiatives were very much needed, be it the devaluation, the lifting of subsidies forcing rationalization, and many others. It is fair to say that the government had the courage to take on historic issues and thus setting a direction for Egypt's economy that we all endorse and appreciate. Having said this, it's time for another round of courage. Another round of courage is absolutely needed now. Firstly, I would start by talking about tax reform. It's an issue of critical importance. I'm not talking about the rate, I'm talking about the mechanics. Allow us to focus on our core business. Our core business is not to hire tax accountants. Our core business is not to spend a third of our time dealing with tax authorities and talking about why COGS should be considered or otherwise. I'm not going to go into details, but our core business, in our case, is agriculture. We should be focused on agriculture. We should be hiring in agriculture, not spending a third of our time dealing with the tax authority and wasting time over issues that, quite frankly, should be done and dusted before we even start. Tax reform is an issue of critical importance today, and I cannot emphasize this further. In addition, allow us to allocate our capital towards our core business. It's not when we go today and overpay on an estimate that's been done with the promise that if we get a verdict in our favor, it will be transferred to credit. Yes, this credit could have gone into buying a line, hiring people, and actually investing in the core business. This all emphasizes the issue and the very urgent need of tax reform. Increase the flow of companies from secondly, after tax reform, the attempt to increase the flow of companies from formal to informal economies. Yes, this is something that's been said over and over again. How do we invite the informal sector to the formal sector? As we do understand that it's quite substantial today, it's not just the incentives. The incentives are maybe the third or fourth priority, but there's an issue of trust. There's an issue of credibility that has to be established first. Create a non-threatening environment. I'm talking about the government role here. Create a non-threatening environment internally. Show goodwill towards the incumbents, because those on the sidelines are watching what's happening inside the ring. So show goodwill towards the incumbents, be consistent about it, and then offer the incentives. We will see a greater flow of informal into formal economies. Finally, it is now time for sector-specific legislation. The economic reform initiatives have set the direction and the path. However, we do need sector-specific legislation to see that journey through. By sector-specific legislation, examples from our own agri-export space include land ownership legislation, been talking about it too long, IPR laws, food safety laws, and total subsidy reform. The subsidies today are directed towards companies, and in my most humble opinion, they should be directed towards the industry. They should be directed towards making the industry more competitive rather than trying to deal with individual companies. So basically, on the government role, we need to see another round of courage to set forward further initiatives that address industries rather than companies, making Egypt more competitive. So with this, I will end here. And if you have any questions or anything, I can entertain them. Otherwise, thank you very much.